Thank you so much, dearest Komal and Cecilia, and to everyone who has traveled far or near to be here today. It is really amazing to see this vantage from where we're sitting. So I will just start maybe a little bit even more broadly. We are sitting with two of the foremost artists working at the forefront of culture and technology. And I wanted to just start with a little backstory, which is when I think about the relationship between art and technology, it is really one that is very rare. Usually, technology does not care about art. So maybe in the Industrial Revolution, there was the birth of cinema and photography. Fast forward to the 1960s, there's a moment when artists and technologists actually do collaborate and converge. And then again now, we're in a very extraordinary time where technology, for better and for worse, has trained its sights on the visual, on the audiovisual, on the media and cultural spheres. And I think back to my own mother, actually, who is a mathematician. And from about 1960 to 1963, she actually worked as a programmer, coding Fortran, for those of you who might remember that, at IBM on Madison Avenue. Maybe I never told you this story. So yes, okay, Anicka's mind's already blown and we haven't even started talking. But she was working at IBM at a time where on Madison Avenue, the mainframe computers were in the store windows as if they were huge sort of attractions or displays. And she always said at the time that she felt like she herself was almost a part of the decor, and yet at the same time, she was at the forefront of this programming revolution. And around the same time, in 1960, artists and people in general were confronting a lot of the same questions that we're confronting now. They felt like technological systems had run amok, had left humans of all genders behind, and that we were facing questions of systems that seemed so dominant and yet so out of control, whether the military-industrial complex, the ecological situation, or, of course, the question of automation and labor. And it's also in 1960 that JFK, President Kennedy, gives this famous speech where he says, "Automation is the single biggest threat facing humanity today." So I like to think that, again, a theme of this talk has been history, but also the future. And I'd love to ask Anicka and Sasha, it is unusual, first of all, for an artist to become deeply involved in the first place, but deeply involved in technology. How did you start to engage? And where do you see this moment, in the relationship between art and technology?
Okay, first of all, I was given a mandate over lunch to spice things up a little bit this afternoon.
Not from me.
Do we want that?
Not from me.
Definitely not from Michelle, but from maybe a few people in the audience. No, I mean, things are always spicy over here, right? So art and technology. I have to make a few disclaimers in order to respond to that properly. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on anything, really.
You are. You are.
I'm not. And I think that allows me to be, have an interrogative kind of mind and not take things for, face value and not be too attached to my own knowledge and expertise. Mm-hmm. And I see that, and then that allows me to just have a wider scope and really, kind of demand, just better ideas, better, systems, better protocols, and all of those things. And I think that as an artist, maybe that's probably one of the best functions that I can mm-hmm. offer, mm-hmm. Civilization is not get too attached to my own importance and my own ideas and my own expertise or something like that. So then I do kind of inoculate these spaces of technology and AI and science and, approach things in a way where I don't take things at, like just because the experts say this, means that, and this is our most enduring theory. And so, art is a really, really important space to ask the right questions. And I feel like that's what I do. when I go into these spaces of technology. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like, and that in and of itself is a lifelong, sort of process to not get mystified by my own kind of thinking, my own practice, and thinking that, oh, this is always going to be the right way, because we're constantly just chiseling and chiseling away at some kind of truer nature of reality. I think that that's a lot of my motivation when I enter these spaces of AI and technology, and we can probably unpack that more as we progress. But Sasha?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I was so looking forward to being here and being in conversation is because I think we all felt very much aligned with this idea that art has a lot to do with science and technology, even if that's not always, thought to be the case. And that certainly is the case for me. And I'll take that even one step further to say that not only am I an artist that integrates technology into my work, but I'm a poet who integrates technology into my work. And I've been doing that for a very long time, but I've encountered a lot of resistance to that, I think, because there is this idea that poetry is quintessentially human, that it is this very sort of pure distillation of what it means to be human. And so I've had to spend a lot of time over the course of my practice really thinking about, why am I drawn to this intersection? Why am I really interested in how art and science and technology and poetry and AI, how all these things come together? And I think a lot of it goes back to my parents on the one hand. I'm the daughter of science documentary filmmakers who did a lot of work, with Carl Sagan back in the day, thinking about, the cosmos, the big questions, why are we here? What is the purpose of life? Like the big questions were really kind of when I was younger.
Sentient beings are, yeah.
But I kind of grew up in that environment and really just thinking about the poetics of science. And I remember, things like my dad taking me to chase Halley's Comet when I was little, and just sitting and, staring up at the sky and just thinking like, I just want to sit with this kind of curiosity and wonder forever. And that's taken lots of different forms over time. And that sort of interlinks with the other piece of this, which is that, like so many of us, I really kind of grew up alongside the technologies that we're really, reckoning with and grappling with now. I mean, I grew up right into the rise of the personal computing revolution. I remember starting to use AOL Messenger when I was in high school. I vividly remember, my first laptop. I remember going to grad school overseas in England and the very strange feeling of typing out instant messages that I was sending to my friends back home. And just all of that was so new and so novel that I couldn't help but really just sit there and like find myself wondering, like, what is my connection to these technologies? What does it mean that I'm able to be on another continent and still sort of touch my family and friends through these cables that are running under the ocean? And I just thought that that was so strange and so beautiful and so sort of mystical, and I wanted to just think about it. And so it became, for me, a really sort of dear and deep and profound topic. And I've been writing about technology for now many, many, many years, and exploring technology in many different ways and writing poems, not just about technology, but using technology to actually create poetry, using software, using intelligent systems, using all sorts of different multimodal approaches to really sort of think about how the history of technology is actually a history of language and expression and creativity. And we sort of want to divorce the two and say technology is this and creativity and imagination is that. But what it comes back to for me is this idea that we create technologies because we have this deep-seated human impulse to say something about our inner lives. And we want to take something that we feel or that we know, and we want to share it with other people. And technologies are the ways that we do that, whether that's art or language, any of these things. And so that's what really gets me excited. And this moment that we're in, as these technologies of expression are rewriting so much of what it means to be human, I can't think of anything more fundamental for me as a contemporary poet and artist to be thinking about and spending my time grappling with.
Yeah, I think, we've been talking a lot today actually about questions of action and of speaking up and of dialogue. But you both actually deal with realms where the normal modes of, let's say, speech or action don't apply. Like, what if things are happening, events that humans can't perceive, at speeds that human can't perceive? What if cognition is happening somewhere that, we really just actually still don't understand in a black box? And Anicka, we're seeing actually images just cycling through of both Anicka and Sasha's work. And I think you can already see, it's so fascinating. Anicka, you've been working in large part with the way that technology means sensation, whether it's scent and smell or sculptural forms or orbs that are literally moving in space and reacting to the air currents and scents around them. And you often tie that to historically or socially specific sites. Like one of my favorite early works of yours, I think, deployed the scent of a Gagosian exhibition of the work of Urs Fischer. And Sasha, you work with language and not only poetry, but also now generative AI and large language models. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, both of you, the way on the one hand, you're working with what turns out to be the forefront of AI based on natural language processing, which is large language models. And I'm also a layperson, so we can, break it down as much as you want to. And then also on the other hand, what's really at the cutting edge of AI right now, which I think both of you are exploring, which are AI models that are taking into account spatial perception, world models, not just language, but actually the physical input that we're all experiencing every day, every second.
So, thank you for that question. Maybe this is the spicy part of the conversation. I want to make a kind of distinctive counterpoint to Sasha's, sort of statement about, what it means to be human and the large language models. And I agree to a large extent that these LLMs and, is very tied to the human. And that's part of why I think I have some kind of discomfort with that, because when I think about existence, like human language doesn't even factor in the top 5 for me. But also, in my work, and as Michelle pointed out, like I tend to decenter the human quite a bit, and I try to kind of offer a counter narrative to the human exceptionalism of us. And part of that is that motivation comes from understanding that we have a very limited understanding of existence and reality because of our embodied, senses and our, the way that our consciousness, functions. So I'm interested in different kinds of consciousness and different kinds of intelligence, which is not to say that I'm trying to create a pecking order around that. But if I'm, again, too attached to the human, aspect of, how I'm perceiving the universe, then I might miss out on quite a lot. And I do think that that doesn't imply that abandoning this form, the sort of like the biological, the anatomical, because as Michelle pointed out, yes, I do tend to explore works through, olfaction and, work that you have to metabolize. Metabolic art, shout out to a genre that's very misunderstood and underappreciated, but art that you have to ingest with your body in order to become, to activate the work, but also to become an active participant. So you're not this passive, viewer, that you become also then, inoculated and a part of, the process and the, the work itself. But so what does it mean to be in this body? What does it mean? And then how do we move past those ripples of our own cognition? So a lot of this is really like my interest in, AI is really trying to get past cognition. And that may sound kind of contrary to a lot of what the narrative around AI today is, knowledge and cognition, but I'm really, really interested in getting past all of that and really trying to see if there's a kind of, another paradigm that we can access. And we'll get into that a little later.
Yeah. Well, if a conversation about AI can't be spicy, then I'm not sure why we would want to have a conversation. But I mean, that being said, I actually don't think we're that far apart on this. I think, to take a step back, I mean, I came to AI, from the point of view of an English language and literature major. I mean, I'm not a comp sci person. I'm not an AI person. I'm not a data scientist. I taught myself how to code because I was interested in natural language processing. I learned about AI because I've been reading, Ursula K. Le Guin and Madeline L'Engle since I was little, and I was fascinated by, thinking about language across species and thinking about alternative intelligences. And so all of that kind of led me to the point where I started learning about natural language processing in 2017. And essentially, just to break it down, like natural language processing, which is powering so much of the generative AI that we see exploding and proliferating today, is rooted in systems that are able to parse human information and learn from it and then respond to us in a way that we recognize, which is not to say that it's speaking human language, but it's learning a lot from our examples and from our data. And so as someone who has been writing my entire life, I love nothing more than words. Like, I love writing, so I never want anyone to think that I'm using AI to outsource the thing that is my greatest source of joy and pleasure in life. But it was because I love working with words that I started to look at what was happening with these large language models and to kind of read academic papers and read studies from places like Google talking about how machines are now able to comprehend our language and respond to us this way. This just sort of made me stop and think, well, what does that mean for me as a writer and as an artist? What does that mean about, the future of this area that I love so much, but also what does it show me about myself as a human being? What does looking at this system show me about my own processes of inspiration and cognition? And so that's been really, really fascinating for me. And I think the more that I've gone into it, the more that it's teased out for me about how complicated language is. I mean, how complicated AI is, because I see AI as part of the spectrum of language, really kind of originating from the human impulse to make sounds in order to express ourselves. That was the dominant mode of communication for a long, long time. And then we sort of moved from orality to literacy, and that was a radically new way of understanding ourselves and the world around us as different, as the leap from literacy to generativity promises to be. And so I really see generativity as the extension of that, and these new ways of sort of saying, well, literacy is not the end-all be-all of how we talk to each other or how we understand ourselves or how we become conscious. It's really, sort of highlighting for us that language is always evolving, that it is, always becoming other things, that it can be sensory, it can be, many other things beyond just us making these weird little shapes on a piece of paper. It was something very different from that for a very long time. Our moment of literacy is actually quite small in the grand scheme of things. And so I'm very preoccupied with, where are we going? What kinds of new sensory organs does this allow us to perceive the world around us with? How does this potentially allow us to look inside ourselves and communicate with our own cells, with our biology, with the insides of our bodies, the things that we don't know at all? How does this allow us to communicate, with the 90% of our brain that we just don't know how to use? So I think there's something really interesting about how this begins to open up vast new possibilities for language, but I use language like very broadly. It's not literally like text-based art.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you're both outlining, these massive shifts in essentially how, the conditions under which we're living, and they're going to happen. They're happening right now, right? So I think that's part of it, where these advances are occurring. For example, you're outlining. Artificial intelligence at one point was really about learning and classifying, like how good is AI at saying, well, that's a pink flower or that's a round table. It's still not totally great at that, by the way. But then it leapt to a period, a few years ago, where AI can now say, I'm learning from all of this, and now I'm going to produce my own flowers and my own table. And so what does that mean? And also for both of you, that has often meant working in spaces that are not normally accessible to artists, that are actually also heavily gendered. And, you know, to spice things up, I could invoke the term tech bro, but but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experiences, like making work. Like Anicka, I know you're working with this digital brain startup right now. Sasha, you're also often working with corporate R&D labs, or working with very high-powered artificial intelligence models that many of us don't actually have access to the source code for. So maybe you could talk a little bit about inserting yourself into those spaces, or actually opening those spaces up.
It's definitely, these doors are not swinging wide open for people who look like me. They just don't. I don't have sponsorship from, some corporation or anything. And it's been like a very long tunneling for decades. Not that I had some singular goal or some sort of apex, sort of like space that I was trying to get to. But, you talk about AI, trying to articulate these flowers and, and then making their own kind of flower arrangements or something. But my question to AI is, does it understand what flowers are? Does it understand what colors are? Does it understand the aroma that it gives off? Does it understand the entire, sort of like system and the network of like where flowers, fall in the kind of, the world of, horticulture and botany and everything else, and pollination and everything. So, I mean, it can tell us a lot of information, but it doesn't, I don't think it really understands that. And I realize I'm probably trying to roll two rocks up, two separate rocks, the gendered rock and then the cognition rock. But I think that there is a parallel there. It's just like, I don't wake up thinking, oh my gosh, the inequities of being a woman, especially in these tech spaces. I don't think about that, but it's just evident. You go to these, these companies or these spaces and these startups, and you're often the only, female person there, or at some kind of decision-making level. So that is definitely just baked into the culture. How do I negotiate that? This is maybe not going to be the easy response to that, but rather than being too attached to equality, as a kind of, position, I, like everything else in life, to try to practice more equanimity, where I'm not vacillating between these, these two poles of deeply craving something or deeply having an aversion to something. And that's usually probably a really good place to enter these startup rooms and any room for that matter. But I do think that, the more that people like us are, making the work and insisting on, a certain sort of, kind of conditions and standards, of course, things can only get better. However, I do think that, it can be this incremental gain. And then you think about like, okay, is that what the goal is? Or like, how can we take a leap, right? It's always somewhat like a kind of a negotiation. It's never just one path, one pace, one cadence, right? So I think that I tend to be very, I tend to, be omnidirectional and tentacular.
Multi-species.
Yeah, and then I evoke all the tentacles and all the, the different species, and never really being too much dogmatic and like, this has to be this way, and I'm doing it for all the other, because it just, I don't really think that having an attachment to these identities is really going to liberate me or anyone else.
Well, it's interesting because we are on the cusp of being massively disrupted as a species in the first place. So it is, and I know, Sasha, you've thought about these kinds of really existential questions.
Yeah, and by the way, tentacular is a great word. I love that. Well, yeah, I mean, well, to kind of tag on what you were asking and then segue into that, I mean, I've definitely found myself being like the odd one out in many of the rooms I've walked into. I mean, whether that is because I'm, a literature major engaging with AI. Back in 2018, that was a very weird thing. Now it's becoming more common, but it wasn't back then. Being a woman in these rooms, I've done a lot of work not only with intelligent systems, but also with blockchain, because I really am very interested in the intersections of multimodal art making and media art production and conservation, and the conceptual nature of media art, and how blockchain can sort of be a next gen printing press for someone like me who wants to write literature that doesn't sit still on a page, or that doesn't fit conventional ideas of what language should be. And that's a very male dominated culture. And I think I've stayed in these rooms first and foremost because these are things that fascinate me. And that drives what I do. That's like, that really is the reason why I do what I do, is because I want to follow my curiosity and follow my interests, but also because I really see these as opportunities for us to shape systems that are otherwise going to be defined for us. And the choice is either stick my head in the sand and say I'm not going to engage with it because I have a problem with how it's being done or what these applications of techno-capitalism are, or I can say these are my imaginings or my hopes or ideas of what I think we're actually talking about when we talk about AI, and then I can try to to do what people have been talking about here today, which is to build our own table and kind of tell stories that I don't see being told. And I think that's really, really important, because we see what happens when dominant narratives take over, and it's really disheartening. I know we talked about it before as well, but it's really disheartening to sort of see the idea of what AI is being calcified in the way that it is, when AI is such a broad, AI is like saying art or saying humanity. It's not like some discrete thing. And to sort of equate it with ChatGPT is ridiculous. And I really think like that's what we're trying to embody in a lot of the work that we do. And by the way, many women artists who are engaging really profoundly and importantly with AI are really trying to sort of create different narratives about what the future might be like if these technologies are utilized and nurtured and cultivated and nourished in different ways, and to really think about it not as a technology to generate slop, but as what it really is, which is a connective technology, a coordination technology, a way for us to really understand each other deeply, not just to talk to each other, because we know that language is a very faulty interface, but to be able to sort of understand from the point of view of the larger human organism what it means to be a human here and now, grappling with everything that we're grappling with. And I think like that to me is a very sort of worthy reason to stick it out in places that are hostile, or to deal with people saying you shouldn't do this because X, Y, and Z. So
Can I add something to that? I mean, I think that's really great. And Sasha and Michelle and I, we had a prelim wow like like last week about some of these ideas. But I think it's also like I think about time, because so much of our relationship to AI is really like the collapse of time, the extraction of time, and everything's supposed to be more convenient, and yet we don't have any more time. And so when I'm interested in soil science, and soil science is about deep time, it's about geological time, it's about microbial time, it's different time scales. And I think about like matriarchal time versus patriarchal time in these spaces of technology. And I think so much of our anxiety around technology is that, we really started to gain consciousness around, like these advanced technologies around the industrial age, and it's so tied to capitalist time and that extraction, like bigger, better, faster. And then it gives us so much anxiety. And how can we shift those time scales into something that's more female time versus like male time or something, and just kind of, to invoke Yu Kui's, like, we need better techno-diversity, that there are different modes and ways of relating to technology. It isn't this monolith. And we really need to change that.
Yeah, and I think I can't think of a better argument for artists to actually change the given systems and not just take them as they are, but imagine actually a different set of worlds. And with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.